A lot we can argue about in politics, but a nation without borders is not a nation.
All right, there he is, former Vice President Mike Pence taking a tour of the southern border, holding a roundtable with the policy group that he founded. This visit from Pence comes ahead of another vote in Washington this week on the bipartisan border bill in the Senate. It's making a comeback. Now, the expectation is it probably at some point will fail again. And then we move on to the possibility of executive action from the president. NewsNation's border correspondent Ali Bradley, more on this, live in El Paso with the latest on the Pence visit. Ali.
Yeah, hey, Connell. So we just wrapped up that visit for the former vice president who was touring the border down here in the El Paso sector. We're actually standing in New Mexico right now, which is an area being exploited by the criminal cartel. While we were standing out there with him, there were actually smugglers up on the ridge that he actually got to see in person. Kind of a first for political visits. Most of the time they stay away from kind of the dangerous areas, but this is fully exploited. This is his sixth trip down here to the southern border, and a lot of people, Connell, didn't really understand why. Why was he down here? What was the point of this visit? And a big part of the visit and a big part of the reason for that visit for him, he says a lot of the focus has shifted off of the southern border when it comes to the media. And he says he wants to be here to keep that focus on the southern border, saying it is a national security issue. Take a listen.
I'm here as a deeply concerned American who lives in the heartland and knows that the crisis at our southern border does not just affect the states in the South. It affects all 50 states in this country. I mean, the fentanyl crisis. I spoke to a sheriff in a county here in Texas who told me he had a 1,400% increase in fentanyl deaths just last year alone. So I'm here as some, not you, Ali, and not News Nation, but some in the media are turning and looking another way.
Okay, so just moments ago, before we ended up down here along the southern border, the former vice president was part of a roundtable that was hosted by current and former law enforcement who have literally experienced this issue on the front lines. We're talking about former Chief Rodney Scott, who was the Border Patrol chief under Mike Pence, and former President Donald Trump, and then also Sheriff Thaddeus Cleveland, who's the current sheriff and former Border Patrol agent. So when it comes to this issue, we saw substantially lower numbers while the former vice president was working with President Trump. We know that the numbers there do not compare to anything like what we're seeing right now. Some of those numbers include data revealing that 2.5 million people were expelled under Title 42 during that time frame. Now 2 million have come into the U.S. since 2021 each year, Connell. So those are some statistical issues that the former vice president was literally bringing attention to and touching on as well down here on this visit as part of the foundation that he created when he was running. So a lot of support for law enforcement down here, and that's what he's pushing for, is to keep the conversation going, Connell.
Now, Pence famously has not endorsed Trump, right, for president this time around. So I was just wondering if there was any Trump talk when he was there, any mention of that, any talk about the election or...
Yeah, of course. I thought it was very important to kind of get his insight on what the former president, what was feasible if he were to get back into office, what would actually be feasible under his administration, because America looks very different right now than it did when they came into office. The high water mark back then, Connell, was about 1.6 million under former President Obama. Then under current President Biden, we've seen a high water mark of 2.4 million, right? So can he legitimately get a handle on this? And the former vice president says yes, he does believe that if Trump were to get back into office, that he will get right to work on securing the border. That will be basically the #1 priority for the former president if he were to win election. I did think that was kind of bold and interesting to hear from the former vice president because, again, as you mentioned, he won't endorse Trump for president, but he is certainly backing those policies that they were both part of. And Mike Pence also doubled down on the fact that he was part of negotiating the Remain in Mexico policy, something that Mexico didn't want to do. And he said, yeah, they didn't want to do it. That's what negotiating is. And that's what we need to do right now. And he said Congress needs to get to work. And I did ask him, Connell, does Congress want this problem more than they want the solution? And he does believe that to be the situation right now. And he says they need to get to work on it and find a solution.
No, we're going to talk about that. And, you know, Pence's other issues. His issues are on other topics, namely January 6th, I think, with his old boss as opposed to immigration, where they agree. Ali, thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Just go to joinnn.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.